Good morning, class. Dr. Weiss just returned everyone's first exam, so I thought I would take about 15 minutes and go through the questions to give you a little insight about approaches that you did or didn't take or could have taken on these questions, and maybe it'll give you a better understanding about the types of feedback I gave you or the grade that you got, or how you could improve on the next exam. So I think all that would be useful to students in the class, especially since we're going through this so quickly. I will say as a general observation before I get into the specific questions that I think on a lot of these questions some of you are really overthinking them. Remember, this was the first test covering the initial chapters in which the very basic concepts of argumentation are laid out. And so what I did in devising these questions was I wanted to get at some very essential and basic concepts, and I wanted to see that you could tell me that you understood these basic and essential concepts and to explain your reasons why you understood them that way. So a lot of times I felt people were just going out on a limb trying to say something that was so far beyond what an initial understanding of the material would suggest. And additionally, and I'm not saying those were wrong or that they were mistaken, but additionally to go that far out on a limb meant that you would have to take a lot of extra time and do a lot of more intellectual kind of gymnastics to make the points that you were making, and sometimes that just didn't happen. Like the answer would be very short but very much off track. So, but anyway, I'll go through each of those and maybe you'll have a better understanding of why I'm saying that. So let's look at the first question. A student in this class is claiming that his arguments are rational because he is using evidence. Do you agree with this? Why or why not? So the reason I asked this question was that I wanted you to understand that the idea of rationality and the idea of evidence are actually completely separate from each other. As a matter of fact, they have no necessary relationship to each other. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say I see what I think is Santa Claus on the roof of my house, and I take a picture of him. And I also take a video, right? And I even have a friend or my wife comes out and corroborates that this person who looks exactly like Santa Claus is on the roof of my house and sees the video and sees the picture. Okay. Then I go down to the police station and I walk in and I say, listen, I just saw Santa Claus on my roof. And I show them the pictures and I show them the video. And of course everybody in the police station is going to look at this and they'll immediately draw the conclusion, oh, someone who's dressed like Santa Claus is on the roof of your house. Or you have a picture of somebody taken somewhere that is dressed or looks exactly like the way we think about the character Santa Claus. Okay? Nowhere would anyone ever accept as rational the idea that I have seen Santa Claus, the actual real Santa Claus, because the rationality of the claim and the evidence that I produce are completely unrelated. In other words, what evidence would you introduce that you had actually seen Santa Claus, since Santa Claus is a made-up fictional character? There isn't any, right? So the point is that the rationality of the claim and how it's defended is completely divorced from any kind of evidence that you would use. Now, since in this case we're talking about something mythical or magical or mysterious, right, you could see that that could never happen. But what if you had something in which the claim was that something that's mythical or magical or mysterious could, through evidence, be proved or demonstrated? In that case, it's the evidence that would be evaluated, not the claim, right? Whether the claim is rational or irrational is completely independent of what the evidence suggests. So anyway, that's one of the reasons that I asked that question the way that I asked it. Now, another side to it, and I think actually a few of you went in this direction, is to suggest that it's irrational to make a claim without evidence if the only way to establish the claim would be to use evidence. But in the example that I gave, we don't know the nature of the evidence that's being used. So you would never say that using the evidence in and of itself would make the argument rational. The necessity would be that if I'm going, for example, let's say I'm a scientist and I'm going to make a claim about the nature of reality, but I have no empirical or any other type of data to make that claim. You would say that I'm not supporting it, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily call it a rational claim in the absence of that evidence. So anyway, that's my thinking on that first question. Okay, another student submits a paper to a professor that is well reasoned, has good sources, and is on topic. In fact, it meets all the requirements of the assignment. She's surprised that the professor gives it a low grade. Is there something the student has overlooked? There was really just one basic notion of argumentation that I was trying to get across with this question, and that is she ignored the fact that the paper will be judged. In other words, that she has looked at all the formal aspects of making an argument, that her reasoning is good, that she has good evidence, right? That she has met the assignment, that she has stayed on topic. And in other words, she's doing all the things that we normally ascribe to a good argument, right? All the characteristics we talked about. But the glaring hole is she has forgotten that the paper will be read by a person who will judge it as an argument. And that's the essential part of argumentation that, as I say in several instances early on in the book, is often overlooked, is that argument isn't just a good argument. It's not just a formally correct argument. You remember the discussion between Lee and Bailey and how they misunderstood these concepts. Our argument doesn't just have the formal characteristics of a good argument. It is written with an audience in mind. There is a conjunction of the arguments you develop and the person you are writing for who will read. I mean, you have all had this experience because you know your professors are different and they will read things differently. They're different types of judges. They judge things differently. So for example, when I was in high school, I had a professor who would fail me if I didn't put my name on a certain place on the paper, because that was part of his rules of how you write a paper. Okay. Now in this case, since we're studying argument, I don't want to focus on such a trivial or minute detail of the paper. I'm thinking in terms of the whole way the paper is argued and thinking about what is the characteristic of this judge. Like for example, if she has good sources, does she use the sources really well in order to make the claim for the professor, depending on who the professor is and again what standards they have? Okay, so that's what I was getting at with that question. Okay, provide an example of a situation where persuasion takes place without argumentation and or argumentation takes place without persuasion or the possibility of persuasion. Okay, but let me talk about the second first because that's really the more obvious one. There's a movie called My Cousin Vinny. It's a courtroom comedy. And Vinny is a very inexperienced and kind of clumsy lawyer at first, but as he goes through the process of trying out a case, he gets much more experienced and does a better job. And by the last day of the trial, he's formulating very well thought out and well expressed objections. And the judge, who doesn't like Vinny, he finds him annoying, hears the objection and says, that's a very well thought out, very lucid, very well stated objection, and then overrules it. The point is, he made the best argument one could possibly make in the situation, and it still had no effect whatsoever. It just goes to show you that a good argument and whatever happens as a result of that are completely unconnected in any way. There's no necessary connection between persuasion and argumentation. That's the latter of the two options. Now the first one's a little more difficult, okay? Because when persuasion takes place, in other words, somebody's mind or attitude or beliefs or behaviors are altered as a result of an attempt of someone to influence them, usually through communication. we usually trace that back and say, oh, so a lot of you gave examples, for example, advertising, but actually a lot of advertisements make arguments. They make very shortcut arguments or very careless arguments or quick arguments, but they're arguments nonetheless. And visual things and interpersonal things can have those kinds of things as well. What I really was getting at in the first instance is when you get what you want as a result of being in a situation in which you want an outcome, a persuasive outcome, something that favors you or benefits you, but you achieve that without argumentation. Okay? So, great example, you go into court because you get a ticket, okay? And you make your argument, right? And then you're found not guilty, and you say, wow, that was a great argument. Then you find out later, talking to the prosecutor, that the judge hates the policeman who testified against you and decided that you were going to win the case no matter what you said. So it took place in the absence of the argumentation that you offered. All right, question number 4. Some would say because arguments need to be logical, there is a little difference between studying logic and argumentation. What do you think? So one thing I always advise students to when you write answers to questions on tests, find the most important word in the question to enable you to answer the question well. Okay, so I would say most students in the class focused in on the word logical as the most important word in this question, but I disagree with that. I think the most important word in this question is studying, because the question is asking you about the difference between studying logic and studying argumentation. There was one student in the class who I think really nailed this answer, who said, if you're studying logic, almost the entire time you're taking a course or reading a book, however you study it. I mean, studying is a broad term. It just means the nature by which you learn or acquire knowledge of a subject matter. That's what it means to study something. When you study logic, you're mostly learning the rules of inference. What is valid? What's invalid? What's a term? What's distribution? What's a conditional? What's a biconditional? What's a negation? What's a disjunction? What's a conjunction? What's a truth table? It's almost like studying mathematics. It is so divorced from the actual content of the arguments. In other words, what the argument says is so secondary to the form of the argument and what the conclusion is. I did take logic as an undergraduate, and almost everything was symbolic. In other words, we had a few examples of real-world arguments the first day of class, but the whole rest of the semester, everything was written as just gigantic arguments with steps where everything was represented as symbols and notation and variables, and then we would solve for validity. So, because argumentation is a much richer study than that, you can see that there are so many other things that you get into. Style, situation, context, judge, rules, topics, emotion, organization. I mean, there are so many extra logical factors in making arguments that tell you that studying argument is a much bigger thing. After all, it's a branch of communication studies. It's not a branch of philosophy. And in philosophy, it's that part of philosophy which focuses on the pure inferential process, again, in basically mathematical form. I mean, there's a 20th century philosopher named Bertrand Russell who basically reduced all of logic to mathematics. So anybody who's a PhD candidate in philosophy who has to take logic exams takes basically what are mathematical exams. In argumentation, we are concerned with every single thing which might help you to, out of your argumentative toolkit, assemble an argument that you would try out in a context to see if it works. So it could even include things like how you dress or your politeness or the tone of your voice. I mean, those are things I don't focus on because other communication courses are more focused on those things, the nonverbal or contextual things. But there are so many other aspects of argument besides just its logical form. Okay, so that's questions 1 through 4. I will deal with question 5 separately.